The morning fog rolled through downtown Seattle like a living shroud, obscuring the Space Needle and turning the city into a ghostly silhouette against Puget Sound. Detective Helena Ruiz stood at the edge of the crime scene tape in Pioneer Square, her breath forming small clouds in the October chill. 3 weeks had passed since the first body appeared, and now they had their fourth victim. The media had already given the killer a name that made her skin crawl: the crime ghost. It was sensational, theatrical, and worst of all, it was catching on. Helena had transferred to Seattle PD from Miami 5 years ago, seeking distance from memories that Florida sunshine couldn't burn away. Her father's murder when she was 15 had set her on this path, but it was the system's failure to convict his killer that had hardened her resolve. Now, at 38, she carried that injustice like shrapnel in her chest, feeling it dig deeper with every unsolved case. This one, however, was different. The killer wasn't just taking lives, they were making statements, leaving behind messages that read like indictments of the justice system itself. The victim, Marcus Chen, lay positioned with disturbing precision in the alley behind the historic Smith Tower. Like the others, he had been a defense attorney who had gotten wealthy clients acquitted of serious crimes. The killer had left him seated against the brick wall, dressed in an expensive suit, with a blindfold made from pages of legal documents. Pinned to his chest was the now familiar calling card, a playing card, the Justice Tarot card, with a single phrase written in elegant script: "The scales have been balanced." Detective Ruiz. The voice belonged to Dario Vergara, a reporter from Como News who had been following the case with the tenacity of a bloodhound. He was young, maybe 28, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that belonged on a toothpaste commercial rather than a crime scene. Helena had dealt with him before, and she knew his type: ambitious, ruthless, willing to turn tragedy into ratings. Any comment on the pattern? 4 lawyers in 3 weeks, all with questionable ethics. Seems like someone's playing judge and jury. Helena turned to face him, her dark eyes narrowed. "Mr. Vergara, you're behind the tape for a reason. This is an active crime scene." But Dario wasn't easily deterred. He had built his career on pushing boundaries, on getting the story others couldn't. His coverage of the Seattle tech corruption scandal had won him a regional Emmy, and he saw this case as his ticket to national recognition. The public has a right to know if there's a vigilante targeting lawyers. Are there other attorneys in danger? The truth was, Helena didn't know. The crime ghost, as much as she hated the name, was unlike any serial killer she had encountered. The victims were carefully chosen, the crime scenes were staged with artistic precision, and there was never any forensic evidence. No DNA, no fingerprints, no surveillance footage, despite Seattle being one of the most surveilled cities in America. It was as if the killer truly was a ghost, moving through the city's shadows without leaving a trace. Her partner, Detective James Morrison, approached with a tablet in hand. Morrison was old-school Seattle, born and raised in Ballard, when it was still a fishing neighborhood. At 55, he had seen the city transform from grunge capital to tech hub, and he carried a weary skepticism about everything. "Helena, you need to see this." Tech found something on Chen's phone, a message received an hour before his estimated time of death. The message was simple but chilling. "Your defense of Cameron Walsh cost 3 lives. Tonight, the debt is paid." Cameron Walsh. Helena knew the name. A tech executive accused of vehicular homicide while driving drunk, acquitted on a technicality that Chen had exploited brilliantly. The 3 victims had been a family, parents and their teenage daughter, killed instantly when Walsh ran a red light at 80 miles per hour. The case had sparked outrage 18 months ago, with protests outside the courthouse and death threats against both Walsh and Chen. But that had all died down, or so everyone thought. Dario, who had been listening from just beyond the tape, was already typing on his phone. Helena could see his mind working, connecting dots, crafting narratives. She knew that by noon, his report would frame this as a story of vengeance, of justice denied and justice sought. It would get millions of views, spark debates on social media, maybe even inspire copycats. The thought made her stomach turn. "Morrison," she said quietly, "we need to talk to Walsh. If the killer is targeting people connected to that case, he could be next." As they prepared to leave, Helena noticed something the forensic team had missed. A small symbol drawn in what looked like ash on the brick wall, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. It was a scale, perfectly balanced, with a sword through its center. She had seen this symbol before, years ago, in a case that had gone cold in Miami. Her hands began to tremble slightly as memories flooded back. Could it be the same person, after all these years? That evening, Helena sat in her Queen Anne apartment, surrounded by case files and empty coffee cups. The view of the Sound usually calmed her, but tonight the water looked black and endless. She had called Miami PD, confirming her suspicion. The symbol had appeared at 3 crime scenes there between 2018 and 2020. All victims were people who had escaped justice through legal technicalities. The cases had never been solved, and then the killings simply stopped, until now. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Detective Ruiz, you're closer than you think, but some ghosts are better left undisturbed. The system you serve is the real killer. I'm just the symptom." Helena's blood ran cold. The killer knew who she was, had her personal number. She looked around her apartment, suddenly feeling exposed. The windows that had seemed comforting now felt like eyes watching her. She reached for her service weapon, checking that it was loaded, knowing it would do little good against someone who could move like a ghost through the city she thought she knew. The next morning brought news that shifted the entire investigation. Cameron Walsh had been found dead in his Bellevue mansion, discovered by his housekeeper when she arrived at 6 a.m. The scene was more elaborate than any before. Walsh was seated at his home bar, a bottle of the same whiskey he had been drinking the night he killed the family placed before him. 3 glasses were arranged across from him, 1 for each victim, and the justice card was nailed to the bar surface with a silver letter opener. The message this time was longer. He toasted to his freedom, while 3 souls found none. Now he drinks with the dead. Dario Vergara was already broadcasting live from outside the mansion when Helena arrived, his camera crew capturing every police vehicle that pulled up. He had somehow gotten the details before the official press release, a fact that made Helena suspicious. "This is unprecedented, Seattle," he was saying into the camera, his expression grave but his eyes bright with excitement. "The crime ghost has struck again, and this time the message is clear. Those who escape justice through legal loopholes are being hunted. The question is, who's next, and can the police stop them?" Inside, the scene was even more disturbing than the initial report suggested. Walsh's laptop was open to a slideshow of the family he had killed, their faces smiling in what looked like vacation photos. The killer had gained access to his personal files, his home security system, everything. Yet the security footage showed nothing unusual, just Walsh entering alone at 9 p.m. and never leaving. The cameras somehow missed the killer entirely, as if they had been selectively edited in real time. Helena interviewed the housekeeper Maria Santos, a woman in her 50s, who had worked for Walsh for 3 years. She was visibly shaken but trying to maintain composure. "He was different these past weeks," Maria said in accented English, wringing her hands. "Paranoid. He installed new locks, new cameras, even hired private security. But last night he sent them all away. Said he needed to be alone to think." Helena made a note. Why would a paranoid man dismiss his security on the very night he was killed? Morrison pulled Helena aside with new information from the tech team. "We've been analyzing the digital footprints, or lack thereof. This killer isn't just avoiding cameras, they're actively manipulating them. The timestamps don't match up, like someone's creating blind spots in real time. We're dealing with someone who has serious technical skills, possibly with access to law enforcement or security databases." The implications were troubling. Could the killer be someone from inside the system? That afternoon, Helena received a call from the FBI. They were taking over the case, citing interstate concerns given the Miami connection. Special Agent Jennifer Chen, no relation to the victim Marcus Chen, arrived from the Seattle field office with a team of analysts. She was efficient, cold, and clearly saw Helena as a small-town cop in over her head. Detective Ruiz, we appreciate your work so far, but this requires federal resources. We'll need all your files immediately. It was not a request, but Helena wasn't ready to let go. That evening, she met Dario at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, a meeting she had resisted but finally agreed to. He had information, he claimed, that the FBI didn't know about. The coffee shop was crowded with university students and tech workers, providing good cover for their conversation. Dario looked different without his camera-ready appearance, more human, more tired. "I received something," he said, sliding a USB drive across the table. "It came to my personal email, encrypted. It's a list of names, all lawyers and judges in the Seattle area, all with questionable verdicts in their past." Helena plugged the drive into her personal laptop, using a VPN she had set up years ago. The list contained 37 names, each with detailed case histories, dates, and outcomes. But what caught her attention was the metadata. The document had been created 3 years ago, long before the current killings began. Someone had been planning this for a very long time. "Why give this to you?" she asked Dario, studying his face for deception. He shifted uncomfortably. "Because I've been investigating judicial corruption for months. I have sources, files, recordings. Maybe the killer knows this. Maybe they want the truth to come out." It was then that Helena realized Dario wasn't just chasing ratings. His own brother had been wrongfully convicted 5 years ago, sentenced to 20 years for a crime he didn't commit because his public defender had been incompetent and the prosecutor had hidden exculpatory evidence. The conviction had been overturned after 3 years, but his brother had already been stabbed in prison, leaving him paralyzed. Dario's crusade against the system was personal, just like hers. They spent hours going through the list, cross-referencing with recent movements and schedules. 3 names stood out as potential next targets, all with court appearances scheduled for the next week. Helena knew she should report this to the FBI, but something held her back. Agent Chen had been too quick to take over, too eager to push local law enforcement aside. And there was something else, something in the way certain evidence had disappeared from the federal database that made Helena suspicious. As she walked home through the drizzling Seattle rain, Helena felt the weight of the case shifting. This wasn't just about catching a killer anymore. It was about exposing something rotten in the system itself. The crime ghost, whoever they were, had opened a door to corruption that ran deep. Her phone buzzed with another unknown number. "You're learning, detective. The ghost isn't the monster. The monster wears a badge and carries a gavel. Tomorrow, another scale tips. Will you be watching, or will you be blind like the rest?" The prediction came true at 10 a.m. the next morning. Judge Patricia Hoffman was found in her chambers at the King County Courthouse, seated at her desk as if she had fallen asleep while working. But the foam around her mouth and the fixed stare of her eyes told a different story. Poison, the medical examiner would later confirm, delivered through her morning coffee with such precision that she had only seconds to realize what was happening. The justice card was placed in her right hand, the scales of justice statue on her desk tipped to one side, weighted down with 30 silver coins. The courthouse was in chaos when Helena arrived, despite the FBI's attempts to maintain order. Agent Chen was barking orders, trying to contain the scene, but the symbolism was too powerful to hide. Judge Hoffman had been known for taking bribes, though nothing had ever been proven. The 30 pieces of silver made the message crystal clear. But it was the file left open on her computer that provided the most damaging evidence: records of offshore accounts, documented bribes, and a list of cases where verdicts had been bought. Dario was broadcasting from outside the courthouse, but his tone had changed. Gone was the sensationalism. replaced by something more somber, more journalistic. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing isn't just a serial killer at work. We're seeing the systematic exposure of corruption in our justice system. The question we must ask ourselves is, how did it get this bad, and why did it take a killer to expose it? His broadcast was being picked up nationally now, with CNN and Fox News running segments. Helena managed to examine the scene before being escorted out by federal agents. Something bothered her about the positioning, the timing. Security footage showed Judge Hoffman entering her chambers at 8:30 a.m., her assistant bringing coffee at 8:45, and then nothing until the body was discovered. But Helena had noticed something else. A small USB drive tucked behind a picture frame on the judge's desk. She palmed it quickly, years of investigative instinct overriding protocol. Back at her apartment, Helena examined the USB drive. It contained video files, recordings of meetings between Judge Hoffman and various individuals, clearly taken with a hidden camera. The conversations were damning, discussing prices for verdicts, strategies for avoiding detection, even jokes about the sheep who believed in justice. But the most shocking revelation was the appearance of Agent Chen in one of the videos from 2 years ago, discussing the need to manage certain federal cases. Helena felt the floor drop out from under her. The FBI agent leading the investigation was potentially involved in the very corruption the killer was exposing. She made copies of everything, encrypting them and uploading them to multiple cloud services. Then she called Dario. They needed to meet immediately, but not anywhere public. She suggested the Washington Park Arboretum among the trees and rain, where surveillance would be difficult. Dario arrived looking haggard, carrying a backpack that seemed heavier than necessary. "I've been investigating all night," he said without preamble. "The list the killer sent me, I've found connections. These aren't random corrupt officials. They're all part of a network, a system that's been operating for at least a decade. They call themselves the Arbiters, and they've been selling justice to the highest bidder." He pulled out printed documents, financial records, communication logs, all pointing to a massive conspiracy. The rain intensified as they talked, creating a natural sound barrier. Helena shared what she had found about Agent Chen, and Dario's face went pale. If the FBI is compromised, if they're actually part of this, then the killer isn't just some vigilante. They're someone who knows the system from the inside, someone who tried to work within it and gave up. They both reached the same conclusion simultaneously. The killer could be a former law enforcement officer, possibly FBI, someone who had discovered the Arbiters and decided to take justice into their own hands. As they prepared to leave, Helena noticed they weren't alone. A figure stood among the trees watching them. When she turned to look directly, they didn't run or hide. Instead, they stepped forward just enough for the grey light to illuminate their outline. Average height, nondescript clothing, could be anyone. Then they spoke, their voice distorted by what sounded like an electronic modulator. "Detective Ruiz, Mr. Vergara, you're close to the truth. Agent Chen has 3 more names on tonight's list. Not victims, but cleaners. They're going to eliminate evidence, witnesses, anyone who could expose the Arbiters. You have 6 hours." The figure melted back into the trees before Helena could draw her weapon. She and Dario stood frozen for a moment, processing what they had just heard. The crime ghost had just warned them, potentially saved lives. This changed everything. They weren't dealing with a simple serial killer, but someone waging war against a corrupt system. Someone who saw Helena and Dario as allies rather than obstacles. They split up, agreeing to gather evidence separately and meet again in 3 hours. Helena went to the precinct, using her access to pull files on the 3 judges and lawyers who had died in Miami years ago. The patterns were identical, the corruption similar. But something stood out. All 3 had been investigated by a federal agent named Michael Torres, who had mysteriously disappeared in 2020. His photo showed a man in his 40s, intelligent eyes, a face that could blend into any crowd. The kind of face that could become a ghost. Meanwhile, Dario worked his media connections, carefully leaking select information about the arbiters without revealing his source. Within an hour, social media was ablaze with speculation. The term crime ghost was trending globally, but now with a different connotation. Some called them a hero, others a terrorist. But everyone agreed that the corruption being exposed was real and shocking. The FBI tried to control the narrative, but it was too late. The ghost had achieved what they wanted, public attention on the corruption, not just the killings. By midnight, Seattle was in the grip of a crisis that transcended a simple serial killer case. 3 more bodies had been found, but these weren't the crime ghost's work. They were witnesses who had been prepared to testify about judicial corruption, killed in ways meant to look like accidents or suicides. Agent Chen had vanished, along with several key pieces of evidence from the FBI field office. The arbiters were cleaning house, and they weren't being subtle about it anymore. Elena and Dario had taken refuge in a safe house that Morrison had arranged, an old cabin in the Cascade Mountains that his family used for hunting. Morrison himself had arrived with boxes of files, his face grim. "I've been a cop for 30 years, he said, setting down the boxes. "I knew there was corruption, but this is systematic destruction of justice itself. Half the convictions in the last decade could be questionable. How do we even begin to fix this?" They worked through the night, assembling evidence, creating timelines, preparing what Dario would later call the story of the century. But Helena kept thinking about Michael Torres, the missing FBI agent. She had found more about him, a decorated officer, commendations for integrity, who had suddenly become obsessed with corruption in the justice system. His final report, filed days before his disappearance, had been redacted so heavily it was almost entirely black ink. But Helena had contacts, old friends from Miami, who owed her favors. At 3 a.m., she received an encrypted file, Torres's original report. It detailed the arbiters, named names including Agent Chen, and recommended immediate federal intervention. Instead, Torres had been branded as unstable, forced into psychiatric evaluation, and then he vanished. His family had been told he committed suicide, but no body was ever found. The parallels to the crime ghost were undeniable. Torres had tried to fight the system from within and failed. Now he was fighting it from outside. Dario was preparing his broadcast, what he promised would be the most important story he'd ever told. He had convinced his station to give him a full hour of prime time, threatening to take the story to national networks if they refused. His producer had reluctantly agreed, knowing that this could either win them a Pulitzer or destroy the station if they got it wrong. But Dario had something they didn't expect, a recorded confession from one of the arbiters, a judge who had been secretly working with the crime ghost. The confession revealed that Judge Harold Brennan had been recruited by the arbiters 5 years ago, but had grown disgusted with what he was asked to do. When the killing started, he recognized Torres's methods, the specific poisons he used, the symbolic staging. Brennan had reached out, offered to help expose the network from within. In exchange, Torres had spared him, using him as an inside source. It was Brennan who had provided the list of targets, who had helped Torres navigate the courthouse security. He was the ghost's human face in the system. As dawn broke over the Cascades, Helena made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She called a press conference for noon, coordinating with Dario's broadcast. She would present the evidence not to the FBI, not to the compromised system, but directly to the public. Morrison stood by her side, as did 12 other Seattle officers who had chosen justice over job security. They drove back to the city in a convoy, knowing that they were potentially driving toward their own destruction. The press conference was held on the steps of the courthouse where Judge Hoffman had died. Helena stood before dozens of cameras, her badge and gun placed on the podium in front of her. "I became a police officer because I believed in justice," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. Today, I stand here to tell you that the system we trusted has been corrupted at its core. The crime ghost, as you call them, isn't the disease. They're a symptom of a justice system that has been selling verdicts to the highest bidder. She presented the evidence methodically, professionally, letting the facts speak. Dario's broadcast ran simultaneously, adding context, interviews, the human stories behind the corruption. Within hours, protests had erupted in every major city. The Department of Justice announced a full investigation. Agent Chen was arrested, trying to board a flight to Mexico. 17 judges and 32 lawyers were suspended pending investigation. The arbiters' network began to collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. But Michael Torres, the crime ghost, was never found. The killings stopped as suddenly as they had begun. A final message was sent to every major news outlet. The ghost is not one person, but an idea. When justice fails, the people must become justice. The work is not finished, but the foundation has been laid. Watch those who claim to serve you. Question those who judge you. The scales must always balance, even if we must tip them ourselves. Some claimed to see him in other cities where corruption was being exposed. Others said he had died, his mission complete. Helena suspected the truth was somewhere in between. 6 months later, Helena stood in her new office at the newly formed Judicial Oversight Commission, a federal agency created in response to the scandal. She had been appointed as its first director, tasked with preventing another arbiters' network from forming. Dario had won his Pulitzer and now hosted a national investigative journalism show. They remained in contact, united by their shared experience of staring into the abyss of systemic corruption and choosing to fight rather than fall. On her desk was a single playing card, the Justice card, that had arrived in an unmarked envelope on her first day. No message, no threat, just a reminder. She kept it under glass, a monument to the idea that sometimes it takes a ghost to remind us that justice isn't just a word or a system, but a choice we make every day. Outside her window, Seattle continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in the shadows someone might still be watching, waiting, ready to tip the scales if they ever became too unbalanced again. The crime ghost had become legend, a cautionary tale told in law schools and police academies. Some called him a hero, others a terrorist, but all agreed on one thing. He had exposed a truth that no one could ignore. The system could be corrupted, had been corrupted, and only vigilance could prevent it from happening again. Helena often wondered if Torres was out there somewhere watching the reforms, judging if they were enough. She suspected she would never know, and perhaps that was the point. The ghost's greatest power wasn't in his presence, but in the possibility of it, the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was always watching the watchers.